Hi, I'm Bob Krist, Sony Artisan of Imagery. I got into photography almost by accident. I was training and working as an actor in regional theater, and one of the companies that I was with got a grant to tour Europe. So I bought a camera. At that time I was about 19 years old, and we went over to Europe. And of course, acting is night work, so during the day I would wander around these different European capitals taking pictures, and another actor in the company was an excellent photographer, and I learned a lot from him. So I kicked around in regional theater for a couple of years after I got back and finished my degree, but photography had kind of bitten me as well, and it was a hobby, and a hobby with which I was making some money. I was shooting some headshots of actors and actresses. I was doing some production stills for theater companies, and one time I was a long time in between jobs, and I was kind of needing some rent money, and a guy that grew up next door to me when we were kids was working as a reporter for a small paper in Union City, New Jersey. And one night he said to me, we're looking for photographers. And I said, well, I've never shot news photography. He said, yeah, but it pays $140 a week. And I said, every week? And he said, yeah. I said, well, I'm there. So I put on my wedding suit and I went down to see the editor in Union City with my pictures of European capitals and pretty actresses' headshots and everything. And he gave me a 3-week tryout because I wore a suit and tie to the interview. And during that 3 weeks, I had incredible luck with spot news photography. I was stumbling onto the most amazing situations and shooting that. And so at the end of 3 weeks, he gave me the job. Now, I was only planning to stay in that job long enough to pay off my MasterCard bill, but I kind of got hooked on this whole business of telling stories, visual stories. And I ended up staying at the paper almost 5 years and kind of learning on the job how to become a photojournalist and a visual storyteller. But how are you going to keep the boy down in Jersey City after he's seen Paris? I wanted to travel. I wanted to go back and see the world. So in those days, if you were an award-winning newspaper photographer, you could get an audience with the director of photography of National Geographic. And so that's what I did. I went down there with my news pictures and about 10 story proposals, some of which were very exotic, French Polynesia, Papua New Guinea. And at the very bottom of the pile was a proposal, the New Jersey nobody knows. And that's the job he gave me. He said, I need somebody to shoot this, and I'm having trouble giving this assignment away. Here, kid, why don't you try it? And so it was a difficult subject for your first story for National Geographic, but I kept my head above water, and that's how I got my foot in the door there. In the ensuing 35 or 40 years, I've done probably about 40 different stories for National Geographic Traveler, the book division, and now I do a lot of work for National Geographic Expeditions. So I've been to probably over 140 countries on all 7 continents. So I've been able to see quite a bit of the world thanks to the camera. As photographers and videographers, we think of ourselves as visual communicators, but it's really important to learn how to write clearly and concisely as well. In fact, it was writing that got me my first job at National Geographic. The director of photography used to say he's up to his ears in shooting talent, but only ankle deep in good story ideas. And so when I came in there, I had 10 story ideas, well-written, well-presented story ideas to give him. And also, a lot of my success throughout my career has come because I was a photo how-to writer. I've written a column in one or another major magazine about photography from 1986 till about 2015. So writing has always stood me in good stead. And even if you're not proposing stories to a magazine, if you're trying to write a proposal or a pitch for a client, an advertising job, an NGO or a foundation that you'd like to work for, you have to be able to present your ideas clearly and concisely in written language. So learning how to write is really important, and it's been a big part of the success that I've enjoyed in my career. In this video, you'll learn about how to move from stills to 4K video, the advantages of shooting video in 4K, how learning to shoot video will make you a better visual storyteller. You'll also learn about tips and techniques for shooting video, the 5 shots and 5 angles I always capture when shooting video, and understanding basic video terminology, my favorite Sony gear and lenses, and finally, the basics of post-production. Now, why should you be interested in shooting video? Well, think about the way we view our images these days. Most of our viewing is done on screens these days, much more than paper. You know, you're on Facebook, you're on Instagram, you're on whatever social media network you're on. So you're looking at more of your images on a screen than you are printed on paper. And screens provide the element of motion and sound. They almost demand that you add those extra elements. A still image looks great on a printed page, but when you get on a screen, you almost need to use some motion and sound because you can, and that's the way most people are looking at things. So motion opens up a whole richer experience of sharing your visuals, sharing your stories. Now, a lot of still photographers are kind of intimidated. They see video as some kind of Mount Everest that they have to scale. But you already have the skills. You know good light. You know good composition. You're experienced at capturing moments. You know, I was skeptical about video at first. I thought that in order to produce professional-looking video, I would need a whole crew, and I've worked my whole life as a one-man band. But with these small light Sony cameras, you can produce professional-looking video as a one-man band. And I was also a little skeptical about 4K at first. I thought, why do I need this? But as I worked with it more, I could see some of the definite advantages of shooting in 4K, even if you're outputting to HD. Well, about 5 or 7 years ago, I was getting ready to go on a real quick around-the-world trip for National Geographic expeditions, and they wanted me to document it in video. And I wanted to shoot some slow motion, and a friend of mine told me that, you know, you might as well pick up a small Sony because they will shoot 60 frames per second and your current brand won't. So I picked up a small Sony NEX5N and a viewfinder and an adapter for my lenses of the system I was using at the time. And I was blown away by the small size of the camera, its responsiveness, the video image, the still image. So the next trip, I bought a second body and a couple of native lenses. And before I knew it, over the course of about 2 years, I had de facto switched systems from my old DSLR system to Sony, and I've never looked back. The things I love about Sony are the small compact size, the great image quality, both in video and stills, the ability to adapt just about any lens ever made. So my old lenses weren't necessarily made redundant. I could still use them. I just love everything about the layout, the responsiveness, and the way Sony just keeps innovating. They just keep innovating. Well, in my travel bag, I've always got the Sony RX10 Mark II. That's my go-to shot getter when I'm on the road. It's incredibly versatile. It's got that 24-200 2.8 lens. It's a Zeiss. It's sharp as a tack. Shoots 4K. It's got the articulated screen. It's got great audio capabilities. It's my go-to travel camera. But I also carry a Sony A7R Mark II. Now, I use this camera in APS-C in the crop mode because I like to carry smaller, lighter APS-C E-mount lenses. The lens that lives on the camera is the 10-18 ultra-wide-angle lens. You know, I'm a still photographer, and still photographers tend to like wide-angle lenses more than cinematographers do. So I'm stuck on that ultra-wide view. I love a big, wide overall whenever I can do it. So the 10-18 stays on there because the RX10 Mark II goes to 24 millimeter, but believe it or not, sometimes 24 millimeter feels a little tight for me. So I like to have that 10-18 for the ultra-wide perspective. The 16-70 f4 is a great all-around zoom for just covering general things, and I use it a lot on the A7R II, especially when I'm in lower light. So if I'm shooting a lot in low light, I'll use that as my general lens because it's the full frame equivalent of a 24-105. So you can shoot an entire assignment in that range. The 35mm f1.8 is a normal lens, and the 1.8 gives you that nice bokeh effect, and it's nice to use indoors or for an interview. And finally, the 70-200 f4 gives me that beautiful reach. F4 is plenty fast for me, and it's still lightweight. That's what I like about it. It's not like carrying around a bazooka. So that's the general purpose that those lenses go for. Now, every once in a while, I'll take a fisheye lens or I'll take a longer lens or something like that, but those 4 lenses are what come with me the whole time. Both in my still work and my video work, I'm a big fan of zoom lenses. Probably because the subject matter I'm shooting, 9 out of 10 times, I have no control over it. It's happening in front of me, and I either get it or I don't. So I prefer a zoom lens for shooting video. Now, one thing I don't do, though, is I use the zoom as a reframing thing. I don't like zooming in while the video is running. I think that for my taste, it's kind of an old-fashioned broadcast technique that I don't like. So I don't zoom while I'm shooting, but I'll zoom to change my point of view very quickly. So a zoom lens for me is essential because, as I mentioned, 9 out of 10 things I'm shooting, I have no control over. If I have control when I'm shooting an interview or whatever, I'll go to a prime lens. But for most of my street shooting, my travel work, anything that's fast-breaking action, for me, a zoom lens does the trick. So what else is in my bag besides those cameras and lenses? Well, I always make sure to have plenty of spare batteries with me. That's one thing you don't want to run out of in the middle of a shoot. But I also have a small Sony shoe mount mic, and I carry an audio recorder as well for doing just some audio pickups. I carry a small tabletop tripod that I can use as a chest brace, and I can brace that camera on the tabletop tripod on my chest and use it kind of like a shooting rig there. I'm also very fond of traveling with a monopod that has 3 feet on the bottom, and I find that that's almost a total substitute for a tripod for most run and gun video situations. I make sure to have plenty of cards, plenty of extra cards, a cleaning cloth, and that's about it. Maybe a small flashlight for those dark areas and stuff like that, or making adjustments in the dark. And that's about it, because I don't want to be too weighted down. One of the great things about using Sony mirrorless cameras is their small, compact size and their lightweight. As a travel photographer, the most important thing that you can be is mobile. You don't have assistants, you don't have the studio, sometimes you can't work out of the back of your car. You need to be able to carry your gear all day and long hours. We start at sunrise and we end at twilight, so those are long days. And if you're petering out, if you're getting tired in the middle of the day because your stuff is too heavy, you're going to miss shots. So these small, compact Sony cameras are ideal for travel work. They allow you to be more mobile, more energetic, and see more things and cover more ground. And that's what it's all about with travel photography. Think about it. Which tripod is better? The big heavy one that you inevitably leave back in the hotel room, or the small light one that you actually carry with you? So many of my colleagues, my professional photography colleagues who work in the studio, when they get out to travel, they want to take all their big glass and everything, and half the time they end up leaving half those lenses back at the hotel because they don't want to carry them. So don't fall for that trap. Remember, mobility is the most important thing that you have going for you. Here are some key techniques for still shooters who want to segue into video. Now, for me, the biggest hurdle was overcoming the tendency to want to get it all into one shot. I was a newspaper photographer. I was trained to tell the whole story in one shot. So if I came upon a scene of a house fire, I'd get the fireman in the foreground with the rescued kitten, and the relieved little kid whose kitten it was in the background with the burning building in the background. You get it all into one shot. And that's what still photographers do. But video is all about breaking the action down into separate, smaller pieces. So you do have that overall establishing shot of the fire, but then you shoot a close-up of the kitten, you shoot a close-up of the fireman's face, you shoot a close-up of the relieved little kid, you shoot a close-up of the smoldering ruins. You tell the story by breaking it down into pieces. And we call this shooting sequences. When you take a scene and you break it down into its composite pieces, you are shooting sequences, and editors need sequences in order to edit a compelling video. Now, there's a couple ways that you can learn to shoot good sequences, and that is you have to learn the 5 angles and what I call the 5 shots. Now let's deal with the angles first. Every visual story in video or in the movies makes use of these 5 basic viewpoints. Not all of them at all times, but a good mix. So what are the 5 angles? Well, there's the overall or establishing shot. There's the medium view. There's the portrait or the twofer, where you have 2 people in the picture. There's close-ups and extreme close-ups. And finally, there's point of view shots. Now, what do I mean by each of these? Okay, let's take your favorite TV show. Let's take Law and Order. One of the good ways to learn how to shoot and recognize the 5 angles is to watch your favorite TV show with the sound turned down. Now, you have to turn the sound down, otherwise you're going to get caught up in the story and you're going to forget about the angles. But let's take a show like Law and Order. You can watch it 24 hours a day, no matter where you are in the world. So it starts off, bump, bump. You've got the wide overall shot of the New York skyline, right? Bump, bump. Then you come into a medium shot. You see Detectives Briscoe and Green walking through Central Park on a hot summer day. Bump, bump. Cut to a twofer. Lenny Briscoe says, man, it's hot. I can't wait to get to the station and to the air conditioning. Bump, bump. Close up. A little dog is chasing a ball into the underbrush. Boom, there's a close-up of a corpse. Bump, bump. Point of view shot from the corpse looking up at Lenny saying, I guess there's no air conditioning for me today. And in the first 15 seconds, you've got the story right there, just the way the editor and the director have sequenced those 5 angles. So, what do you put in those 5 angles? Well, that's where we talk about the 5 shots. What's the content? And again, these are not hard and fast rules, they're general rules. So what are the 5 shots that you put in those 5 angles? Well, there's the close-up of the action. There's a close-up of the reaction to the action or who is conducting the action. A shot establishing where the action is taking place. The point of view shot of the person conducting the action. And then creative beauty shots and close-ups that tie into the action. Now, even though an individual shot in a final video will only stay up there for 3 or 4 seconds, it's important when you're doing those 5 shots and 5 angles that you hold on the action long enough. You want to be able to capture the moment. You want to give your editor a choice of picking that section of the clip that works the best. And you want to give your editor what we call a head and a tail, so if they need some dissolve time to move in and out of a shot, they have it. So I like to say hold a shot a minimum of 10 to 15 seconds, even if it's something that you know will only stay up on screen a few seconds in the final. It's important to hold on each shot to make sure your editor gets what he or she needs. Another thing that you can't overemphasize is the importance of close-ups. You really need a lot of close-ups for your editor to move in and out of different sequences. So shoot a lot of close-ups. They say, you know, you should have maybe 5 close-ups for every overall. You might want to bump that up to 10 close-ups for every overall, and you'll be your editor's favorite shooter if you give him a lot of close-ups. Another thing that we tend to do as still photographers is what they call jump cut. We tend to shoot too many frames that have similar framing. So we jump from one similar frame to the other. It's called a jump cut. Sometimes it can be effective when it's used deliberately, but most of the time we need to shoot sequences. We can't keep shooting overalls, for instance, or medium shots and just keep laying them one after the other. It's called jump cutting, and it doesn't work. It's very jarring to the viewer. So there are a number of ways to avoid jump cutting. If you have a zoom lens, you can zoom in and shoot some close-ups. You can zoom with your feet and get closer. You can shoot a close-up or a cutaway. Anything that stops you from shooting one medium shot after the other or one overall after the other. That's why close-ups come in handy, because they allow you to segue in and out of different shots, and they prevent the jump cut. So use that zoom lens, zoom with your feet, try a different angle of view, anything to avoid just getting that same type of framing and jumping from one scene to the other without mixing up the angles. You got to keep those angles coming, and you've got to use close-ups to give your editor a way to get in and out of a scene. Another way to avoid jump cuts is to physically move around your subject. Get different points of view, get over his shoulder, get close-ups, get low, get high. Always keep moving, shoot and move, shoot and move. Your job is to provide as much choice as possible in the cutting room so you can make a really strong visual sequence out of any given action. Now, one way that you can quickly change your angle of view is to flip out the articulated screen on the Sony camera and shoot from a low angle, flip it up, shoot from a high angle. It's very, very convenient to use, and having that flip out screen just makes you a better shooter. It makes it easier for you to vary your angles. So let's say that you're ready to take the plunge and create your first 4K visual story in video. How do you analyze the situation to understand whether or not it has potential to be a good story? Because there are certain things that lend themselves to a good video and certain things that don't. You need some action. Well, a friend of mine, Bob Sasha, a National Geographic photographer who made the move to video very early on, has developed kind of a rubric, a 5-question thing to analyze the situation to see whether or not it has potential to be a good video. So let's take a look at some of Sasha's 5 points here. First thing is character. Is there a main character through whom the story can be told? Is he or she interesting and able to communicate the story? Are there supporting people who can corroborate and support the main character? So a lot of good video stories will hang around one interesting character. Secondly, is there an actual story arc? Is there a process with a beginning, middle, and end? Does the character go through a change? Does he or she overcome an obstacle or resolve a conflict? Every good story has that kind of story arc. Third thing, is it visual? Is there a process through which the character is going that is visible and visual? Can it be seen? I mean, if you're going to do a story about your meditation teacher and they're sitting there, it's kind of hard to see what's going on in their head. Now, your yoga teacher, on the other hand, is doing something that's able to be seen. So pick the right subject, pick the right character. Access. Will they allow you to witness their process? Can you physically get close enough to record the story? If you cannot get access to the subject, if they don't want you to see the whole process, well then maybe that's not the right story for you. And finally, time. Do you have enough time to witness and film the evolution of the process? If things are going to be rushed and they're only going to do it once for a minute and a half, it may not be the right thing for you to shoot as your first story. So start with baby steps. Identify those 5 actions, shoot a sequence of each of those actions, and before you know it, you're a visual storyteller. There are a number of advantages of shooting in 4K, especially if you're outputting to HD. First of all, you've got 4 times the area, the picture area, so you're going to get better sharpness. It just looks sharper and crisper, even in HD. Now, that larger image makes it easier for your software to stabilize images that are shaky that you might have handheld, because the stabilization in your nonlinear editor involves cropping into a picture. So if you've got more to crop into, you can do more severe stabilization and make it look natural. So those larger images makes it easier to stabilize. The larger image also makes it easier to do moves over your frame, like the Ken Burns effect, crops, reframing, etc. And in interview situations, you can make one camera look like a 2-camera interview because of the lossless cropping. You can punch in on the image and make it look like you're jumping between 2 cameras. Of course, 4K is future-proofing your work. Pretty soon 4K is going to be the standard, and you want to make sure that your work is going to be applicable as time moves on. And finally, for professionals, clients and film stock houses are demanding 4K, so it's a market-driven thing as well. So those are the advantages of 4K. But 4K doesn't mean huge dollar investment. Sony offers 4K at various price points and capabilities, so you can get your feet wet with, say, the RX100 Mark IV, and then see how you like it and move on up to some of the bigger cameras. So some general settings that I use when shooting video. I just leave my picture style in portrait. It's a nice low contrast mode, and I shoot in the portrait picture style. I like to shoot in shutter priority. I set my shutter speed, and then I'll lock my exposure before I start rolling on everything, so I don't get any changes of exposure during a shot. But I like to have it in shutter priority. A lot of people like to shoot full manual. I like to eliminate one step and use shutter priority. Those are about the only two changes that I do from my still shooting. In still shooting, I usually shoot aperture priority, and when I'm shooting landscapes or whatever, I'll go into vivid mode or whatever. But for video, I go into portrait mode for the picture style, and I shoot in shutter priority. But of course, you have to find what's comfortable and what works for you. So when I'm shooting in shutter priority, I always hit the exposure lock button before I start rolling. And that way, if there's a change in the middle of a shot, you don't get that pulsing dark to light look. And that's why most people like to shoot video in manual. Well, I like to save a step by using the shutter priority, but I'm always sure to hit exposure lock before I start rolling. And then I'm also always sure to, turn it off when I recompose. So it's just that extra little step, but it prevents those wild variations in exposure that you can get if you're shooting in an automatic mode. Now, if you're coming to video from stills, you might be a little confused about frame rates. We have so many choices. What do they mean? What are they good for? Well, 24 frames per second is the cinema standard. It's what the movies use. And it actually originated back in the film day, and it was determined that 24 frames per second, still frames per second, were the fewest amount of frames that they could shoot and still give the feeling of motion. So in order not to use too much film, they shot 24 frames per second, and that's what we're used to when we're looking at movies. 60 frames per second was the video standard, and it looks like broadcast news kind of video. But 60 frames per second and also 120 frames per second is great to shoot because when you slow it down to a 24 frame per second timeline, it's slow motion, and it's buttery smooth slow motion because you have all those frames. Now, slow motion is one of the most powerful tools that you have as a videographer. It can really emphasize things. It can show the beauty of a breaking wave or a beautiful girl with her hair in the sunlight spinning around or whatever. So slow motion really helps us as visual storytellers make that point. So I shoot usually in 24 frames per second, but if there's something that I want to go into slow motion that I think I might want to, and that's any action, horses running through water or athletes, I'll shoot at 60 frames or even 120 frames per second. That's one of the greatest developments with these Sony cameras. It's been determined over the years that the ideal shutter speed to shoot is about twice your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be ideally 1/48th of a second or 1/50th of a second is close enough. Now, when you crank up to 60 frames per second, your shutter speed goes up to 125th of a second. And if you're shooting 120 frames per second, well, then 2/50th of a second is the ideal shutter speed. It's called the 180-degree rule, and it allows just enough motion blur in each frame for the video to look natural and fluid. Now, if you shoot too slow a shutter speed, your image smudges. It kind of looks like, and this is an effect that you can use. It's often used in movies to simulate a drug trip or when somebody's been drugged and they see images starting to smudge. That will, a slow shutter speed, a half second or whatever, will give you that smudge kind of look. If you shoot too fast a shutter speed, a 800 or a thousandth of a second, the image looks staccato and unnatural. Now again, this can be used to your advantage. If you look at the first 3 minutes of Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, the landing of D-Day on the beach, he shot that all at an 800th of a second. And it has this hyper-real, hyper-staccato look that's very effective. But in general, we want to keep our shutter speed to be about twice the frame rate. You're living now in a world that basically has one shutter speed. So how do you control the light coming into the camera? You can use your aperture ring, of course, but let's say you want to shoot a nice wide open shot outside in bright sunlight. How do you shoot a 50th of a second at f2.8? Even at ISO 100, you'll be 6 stops overexposed on a bright sunny day. Well, here's where neutral density filters come in, especially variable neutral density filters. Those filters that when you twist, you get between 2 and 8 stops of neutral density. By screwing one of those onto the front of the lens, you're able to filter out enough light that if you want to shoot wide open at f2.8 on bright sunlight with a 50th of a second, you can do that. So neutral density filters are very, very important to control exposure outdoors for us because we're living in a world that has one shutter speed. How important is good audio? Well, think about this. You listen to audio without pictures every day of your life. You listen to the radio. But when is the last time you watched a silent movie? Another hard lesson for us still shooters to learn is the importance of audio. We are so used to concentrating on the visual that we kind of neglect our audio. And that's a shame because really good audio is essential for good video. In fact, sometimes it's more important because they say that people will forget or forgive bad visuals, but they will not forgive bad audio. So what I use in general is a little on-camera mic, one of the Sony on-camera mics, for general ambient sound. When I'm shooting at a festival or a fair or outdoors, I'll just use a small on-camera mic to gather what we call that natural or ambient sound. But when I'm shooting an interview, I'll use a shotgun mic on a boom stand or a lav mic pinned to my subject to get really rich interview audio. The secret with mics is to keep them close to the sound source. The closer the mic is to the sound source, the cleaner your sound will be. It's the signal to noise ratio, they call it. So the closer it is to the sound source, the cleaner that, the stronger the signal and the less the noise. And the second thing is to protect the mic from the wind, because wind blowing over a mic makes a very annoying sound that can really grate on you after a while. So keep the mics close to the subject, to the sound source, and protect them from the wind. And if you do that, you're 9/10 of the way to good audio. Well, as a digital photographer, you know how important post-production is to preparing your images. The same thing is true of video. You've got to do some post on all those clips to make them into a story. Now I'm going to introduce you to a couple of the basics of the post-production process. And knowing the basics of editing is going to help you become a better shooter because you'll know what your editor needs. Well, I'm going to show you a project that I've just shot for a friend of mine. And he's been documenting painting the same small fishing village in Maine for 7 years. And what I'd like to do is share with you how we've applied some of these things about the 5 shots and the 5 angles in the real world so you can see how it works. Now, I'm editing on Final Cut Pro 10, but you can use any nonlinear editor from iMovie all the way up to Premiere. The concepts remain the same no matter what the editing program is. Now, the first thing I do when I ingest all my clips is to give them keywords, to keyword the various collections. So you can see here in this video, I've got the different situations all done by keywords. Bob paints the dinner scene. All those clips of him painting the family having dinner is organized by those keywords. I organize them by keywords, so then I'm not having to search through every clip I've ever shot when I'm trying to create sequences. I know that if I'm going to shoot or edit a sequence of the church, I go to the keyword collection of church, and bingo, they're all there. So it's a great time saver to do something to organize your clips, whether it's keywords or putting them in folders. So let's look at a sequence here, and this is the part where the artist is telling us about the fishermen sitting around after they come in at a table in the general store called the liar's table. I guess fishermen are great liars.
She told me about the liar's table, which is where the lobstermen gather at an old dinner table in the variety store after they come home from their catch. The first painting I did in town was the liar's table. The lobstermen didn't talk to me while I worked, but by the next day, everybody in the village knew I was there.
We start here with the wide overall shot of the fishermen sitting around the table. You don't always have to start with your wide shot. In fact, it's often better to start with a tight shot. But in this case, I started with the wide shot. Then we go to a medium close-up of one of the fishermen talking. Then we go to an extreme close-up of the hands of another fisherman, the rugged hands while he's listening to the table talk. Then we go to an extreme close-up of another fisherman listening and his face there. Then we cut back to another overall wide shot, this time with the dog in the foreground there, trying to add some atmosphere. Then we cut to an extreme close-up of the fisherman smiling and laughing at what's going on at the table. Then we go back. Now he's talking about the next day. So we use a dissolve and we go to the next day and we see there's more fishermen, different fishermen sitting around there. So we see two fishermen are playing cards there. We go to an extreme close-up of the hands playing cards, a twofer shot of the two fishermen playing cards, an extreme close-up of one of their faces, an extreme close-up of the hands shuffling their hand of cards. So you'll notice the reason that we do this and shoot these sequences is here the artist is telling a story, and we wouldn't want to cut from medium shot to medium shot to medium shot. So we're going to mix it up so it has a flow. So this is that nice kind of visual narrative flow that a video allows us to do. We don't hold on one overall shot for the whole 15 seconds of the story. We want to make it flow. So every time that you're shooting anything, you're shooting in terms of the 5 shots and the 5 angles, because that will allow you to make a nice sequence that will cover a lot of B-roll or voiceover that you have to cover later on. So it's a simple technique, and basically, there's not much happening here really. So, you just can't hold on a shot of a bunch of guys sitting around on a table. You've got to add some motion and interest to it, and you do that by mixing up these shots in different sequences. Now, when I was shooting this sequence, these aren't the only shots I shot. I must have shot probably, maybe 100 different angles. But in the edit, we only ended up using these. You always got to shoot until the situation kind of disappears, and then you'll have it covered. Now, in this particular case, I was trying to be a little unobtrusive because I didn't want to be jumping around, because these are old lobster guys, and I didn't want to appear to be too much of a prima donna. So I was hanging back with my RX10 Mark II with its 24 to 200 millimeter zoom lens. So I was able to get everything from a wide shot to a tight shot using the zoom lens and just moving around the perimeter of the scene. I never really had to inject myself in, get too close to these guys. I didn't want to call attention to myself. So between moving my angle and using the great zoom capability of the RX10 II, I was able to shoot a sequence without disturbing the ambiance of what was actually going on. Now in this next sequence, we have the artist leaving his cottage in the morning to go to work. And in this particular case, I asked him to do this action 3 times so I could shoot it from 3 different angles. We start with the empty cottage from the outside.
I spent summers in New England as a kid. When I got older, I started going to Maine.
He closes the door.
There's kind of a harmonic on the coast that really suits me. One summer, I decided to go farther north.
And you see, we end with him walking out of the frame. So what we have is a nice little slice of time with 2 cut points. We start with the empty cottage, with the door opening, him coming out, and him walking through the frame and out of the frame. Now, it's natural to want to follow the action, especially for us still photographers, but this is something you got to practice. When somebody's walking through the frame, let them walk in and right out again. Don't follow them, don't fire hose. You can always turn around and do another shot of them walking away. That's perfectly legitimate, but you want to give yourself places to cut and ways to indicate the passage of time. And letting your subject move in and out of the frame is a great way to do it. Now, in the timeline, most of the time, a quick cut from one frame to the other is going to be fine. But every once in a while, you'll want to use some kind of a dissolve, a cross dissolve, a fade to black, something like that. Usually dissolves indicate a passage of time or a change of scene. You don't want to overuse dissolves. That's another kind of telltale sign of a still shooter going to video. We tend to throw dissolves between everything. But actually the natural human way of moving from one scene to another is a hard cut. So probably you're going to be using 9 or 10 hard cuts for every dissolve. But when you need them, the dissolves and the fade to color are great transitions. Now, when you're moving from one clip to another, a hard cut is usually fine. And when it's done properly, it's completely seamless. It does not seem to be jarring. But every once in a while, you're going to need a dissolve or a fade to color to indicate a moment in time changing or a change of scene. But use them sparingly. Most of the time, a hard cut will do it, especially if you do it well. Now, when you've done your editing and your cuts and your music and your sound, and it all blends together effortlessly, it becomes one whole, and your viewer will not notice cuts and different changes of music. It becomes one smooth, fluid storytelling line, and that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming for that fluid storytelling that will draw the viewer in and make him or her forget about the techniques that you've used and get lost in the story and the visuals. So here are a couple of ways shooting 4K is a big advantage in an HD timeline. Remember what we have about 4 times the real estate on the frame. So we can see here on this particular shot of the man sitting against the wall, if we looked at this shot in its actual size in 4K, look at that. That's 1/4 of the frame filling an HD frame. So we don't want to crop it that severely, but let's say we want to add a little crop onto that. And so we'll go into crop and we can just like eliminate that bench, let's just say there. And then that's done. And now we've got a cropped image, but no loss in image quality. So that's just one of the ways that we can take advantage of a 4K image in an HD timeline. Here's another way. Let's say we want to do a Ken Burns move across the bigger frame. So we go into crop and we go into Ken Burns, and now I can create a move right here in the 4K image without losing any quality whatsoever. So we've got a nice move like that, and you see there's no quality loss whatsoever. So it's really, really a very nice extra bit of real estate that we can use. So this panning across the image is something you can do in any editing program. It may not be called Ken Burns in your particular editing program, but the concept remains the same. You can pan across or crop into an image without losing any quality because you have up to 200% of a crop there with the 4K image, and it's a wonderful tool to have at your disposal. Another way that shooting 4K and using it in an HD timeline can be helpful is to give you some added stabilization, some added real estate in which the stabilization program can crop in and use to give you an ultra steady shot. Now in this one frame here of the aerial, actually the 5-axis stabilization in the Sony a7R II was doing a great job, but I was in a little microlight plane and we were getting buffeted around by the wind, something terrible. So there was really a little bit of jitter in there. So you'll notice that I can now just add some stabilization, and it crops in just a little bit, but it gives me an ultra steady shot and there's no loss in quality. So cropping in to stabilize is another advantage of shooting 4K and using it in an HD output. So along with the added sharpness and crispness of the image and future-proofing your work, shooting 4K and outputting in an HD timeline, these are a few of the other advantages. You can get more stabilization, you can pan and zoom across the image, and you can crop into the image, all 3 effects without any loss in quality at all. So let's look at another sequence, in this case the opening sequence, to see how frame rates can allow you to use slow motion. I shot some of this in 60 frames so I could go to a slow-mo, and also we'll look at how we layered some of the sound, the narration, the music, and the natural sound to create a soundscape. So let's watch this first 10 seconds or so of this opening sequence.
Fishermen are like farmers. They have to know a lot. Their lives revolve around the seasons, the tides, the moon. They have to be able to make and repair things, as well as catch fish. When you're 15, 20, maybe 50 miles off the coast, you need to read the weather, to fix an engine that doesn't run. There are big consequences to what they do.
So what we have there is we held on that one shot for a long time so we could run the title over it. But we still kept the sound effects. We had the sound effect of the plop of the lobster going back in there, but the slow motion kind of made a mythic quality. He's describing the mythic quality. So if we scroll down here to see what was going on with the audio at that time, you'll see here 3 different tracks. We've got his narration, we've got the music, and we've got the natural sound, the seagull cawing, the hum of the diesel engine. And this is, we mix them and blend them together to create a soundscape. And sound design, I find to be one of the most fun things about editing. You're creating a landscape of sound as well as this visual story. So it's a real multimedia experience that engages, all your senses, both as an editor and a viewer. You know, one of the things I didn't realize in the beginning is how much music can add to the mood of your piece. And when you find the right music to go with those visuals, it really creates an ambiance that is really fantastic and quite exciting. Now, it means you're going to listen to a lot of music tracks, but when you find the right one, it works like magic. And finally, after you've got it all laid in, you're going to do some color grading. And color grading is movie talk for, adjusting the color. We do it, you're adjusting the contrast, you're adjusting the saturation. They call that grading. We photographers just called it fixing the image. That's what we did to most of our images. But it's called color grading. So if you want to sound hip with your video buddies, call it color grading. And finally, you're going to output that movie so you can put it up on your YouTube or your Vimeo channel, and they both support 4K, so you can output the movie in 4K and output it in HD, and that will be done from your video editing program as well. I like to make backups of everything. Everything that I shoot lives on at least 2 and preferably 3 different drives for that multiple kind of backup in case one drive decides to take a flyer off the edge of the table or just decides to up and die. You've spent all this time creating this masterpiece, now back it up and back it up a couple of times. You can't be too rich, too thin, or have too many backups in the digital world. It's important to realize that photography and videography is a constant process. You're always learning. There's always something new you can learn, something new you can experience. So never stop watching these instructional videos online. Never stop seeking out workshop instructors or mentors. I know at the ripe old age of 65 now, I'm constantly taking online courses, learning new things. You're never too old and you're never too smart to learn something new. In this video, you learned about how to move from stills to 4K video, the advantages of shooting video in 4K, how learning to shoot video will make you a better visual storyteller, tips and techniques for shooting video, the 5 shots and 5 angles I always capture when shooting video, and understanding basic video terminology, my favorite Sony gear and lenses, and finally, the basics of post-production. We've gone over some of the basic techniques for moving from still to video storytelling. Now it's time to put them to use. Go out and find a story close to home that interests you. Try to create a good, tight 2 to 3 minute video that tells that story. And certainly, before you go on a big worldwide trip, practice locally so you can shoot globally and become a great visual storyteller.